Tonight we are going to continue our second part of the two-part series talking about using taxpayer dollars in the game of Monopoly. Well, of course, what we did a couple of weeks ago is that we had audio of a closed meeting that was held in the city of Maplewood by the Maplewood City Council when they were considering what price they were going to pay for the Moose Lodge property in the heart of the Gladstone neighborhood. Now, the reason that last time around we talked about playing Monopoly with taxpayer dollars is because you see, this particular property, there was another interested party who wanted to buy the parcel of land. And they had put in an offer to the Moose Lodge about this intent of theirs. Well, it turns out that the city of Maplewood, because of their grand plans of wanting to put in high-density voucher housing at that location at the tune of 50 units per acre, they wanted to make sure that they secured the purchase of that property. And so they had also made an offer to the Moose Lodge for the property. Well, lo and behold, the other private party, their price, well, was higher, or so it appears from listening to the discussion of that audio of that closed meeting, and that the city council then was challenged with the idea of, do we let this other entity who wants to buy the property get the property for the price that they are offering, or are we going to outbid them because we have endless taxpayer dollars and we can spend whatever we want to secure whatever we want, even if it isn't even related to the market value of that property? To help me with discussing this concept and this meeting and the rest of the closed meeting audio is Mr. Joseph Waters, who's been on these programs before in the past. So thank you, Mr. Waters, for being here.
Thank you. I've always wanted to play a real life game of Monopoly. I wanted to always use somebody else's money. Kind of reminds me of a movie from the 90s, OPM, Other People's Money.
Well, and that is exactly what we see that they're doing up at Maplewood. And one thing, before we get started, we should probably talk a little bit about the open meeting law so that people understand why we have the audio a year after the fact. Because quite frankly, under the Minnesota open meeting law, there are a couple of provisions by which a city council can close their city council meetings. One of which is for negotiations to talk about purchasing property and what goes into those negotiations. So that's the exception to the open meeting law that this city council invoked in this instance. And with this, of course, now I should also mention that when there's going to be a closed meeting, the city council, they have to notice that they're going to be meeting, but that there's an intent to close the meeting, and then they have to say before the meeting begins why they're going to close the meeting and what is the statute and the exception to the open meeting law that they're invoking and why they can close this meeting. The law also requires that even though they go into a closed session, that they have to audio record what goes on at that meeting so that later on, once the transaction is completed or it's fallen through, whichever the case may be, that audio then is available through the Data Practices Act, where a person can request that they get a copy of the audio, and that is what we did. That is how we have this audio. So what we've done so that our viewers can really follow who's saying what, because with an audio, it's kind of hard to know who's saying what if you're not that familiar with the players. What we've done is that we've taken still shots of the various people who are speaking, and that when they speak, we put their headshot up with their name so that you can identify who is speaking, who on the council, who on staff, and that way it's easy to identify who is representing what ideas. Now, Mr. Waters, any thoughts before we get started?
Well, just one thing, because we talked about the closed meeting, just to let you know, or you can correct me if I'm wrong. When you close the meeting, you have to say you're closing the meeting. You also have to talk about what the subject of the meeting, why you're closing the meeting. It's a real estate deal that we're looking at. And then I think you mentioned the chapter. So you do have to give, I believe you have to give a purpose. You don't have to give any details. You may have said that. I just want to clarify that.
Right, and also, they're not supposed to be taking a vote on any of the matters that they're discussing in that meeting either. That if they're going to be taking a vote, they actually have to come out of that closed meeting into an open meeting and then announce what the motion and the second is, and then the vote has to be in public. And so, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the other thing is, these are more frank conversations. So when you're just listening to some of your past broadcasts, you really get the true sense of what the council is thinking versus what you would get in an open meeting.
Yes, absolutely, and especially when it comes to this subject of exactly what money should be spent, how high should they go when they are bidding, and also the idea that they are willing to outbid any private entity or individual in the open marketplace to get what they want. Now that, of course, is a startling commentary that I don't think that they're saying in an open council meeting. They are also indicating in what we showed the previous program that the city attorney is saying, well, you know, we may buy this property for $935,000, but if we can't find a developer who wants to develop it, we may have to give this property away to that developer in order to entice them to do a development there. And then on top of that, we're going to have to do tax increment financing in order to simply try to get the money back of the taxpayer dollars that we spent to get this property just so we can flip it and give it for free to a developer.
Yeah, once you do that, you kind of look at the two core cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis has a lot of development going on. And I know from the fact that if you go to the council and say, I want TIF dollars or something like that, they'll say, there's the door, don't let it hit you on the way out. On the other hand, you go to St. Paul, it's like, we won't do a project unless we get TIF dollars. So once you open up that TIF door, it's very, very hard to close it. So they need to be very careful about doing something like that.
Right, it sets up that expectation. And in this particular closed meeting of March 2018, the City Council has actually already identified the developer that they believe that they are going to flip it to. And of course, that does not seem kosher. It seems to foreclose all other developers from the area if they already have it in their mind that they're going to be flipping it to Sherman and Associates, who they gave tax increment financing to just across the street for that development that he did on that other corner.
Yeah, see, that's not in the best interest of the taxpayers. In the best interest is to have a competitive RFP process to see what is out there. I don't know what the city is so afraid of doing something like that. Because I was at a meeting yesterday where they were talking about an industrial project or a project over in North Minneapolis where it's a large industrial piece of property. It's about a mile in length. And the city put it out for RFP, and only 2 developers actually came through, a minority contractor and a big name contract or a big name developer came through. All the others said, no, we don't want to touch it because it's too challenging of a project. This I don't see as a challenging project, but it'd be interesting to see by opening it up through an RFP process, a request for a proposal. I talk in ease all the time, but by opening it up to the market, it'd be real interesting to see what kind of proposal you could get back, and then maybe the city could actually recapture its money that way versus this other backdoor trick.
I like it that you call it a backdoor trick. So let's get started again with this audio from the closed meeting back in March of 2018, where the city council is debating how much they're going to spend to outbid a private party who wants to buy the Moose Lodge. And we're coming in right at the point where Council Member Marley Abrams is scratching her head, wondering, do we have the money and where will we get it from? And we're going to hear from the finance director about their ideas they had in the beginning that were not well hatched out, and that now they have to go into a different pot of money to find the money there. So let's take a look.
Numbers on the air track.
So Ellie, where do we get $1,065,000?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question.
Yeah,
Well, the last sheet does have a
$1
total,
million
Brian.
Where do we get that?
So,
to buy this?
so
And
we
we know
were-
that that's not enough at this point because somebody else is interested.
Our intent was to,
You heard Councilmember Marley Abrams say, but that's not enough because somebody else is interested. Like I said, sky's the limit to get that parcel without any regard to what the market value is or what the market will bear, and they don't have any housing studies done in Maplewood with regard to putting housing at this site and the need for it at 50 units per acre.
Can
Go
I ask
ahead.
you a question? You've done a lot on eminent domain reform. Instead of just, acting like we have a blank check, why didn't they just use eminent domain? Would the reforms in place prevent them from doing that?
Well, now, see, that's an interesting question because back in 2006, the eminent domain laws were changed in such a way that a government cannot do eminent domain to buy property to then flip it to another private entity. So, for instance, they couldn't just say, well, we're going to exercise eminent domain. We're going to give the Moose Lodge their market value for the purpose of then we're going to flip it to Sherman and Associates. Because, of course, that would be exactly what happened to Walzer down in Richfield in the Bloomington area when they were taken out of their property and it was flipped over and given to Best Buy to build their headquarters. And so you see, that is exactly what the 2006 law was modified to change so that the government can't just go and take one person's property the way they're using it and flipping it and giving it to somebody else because the government thinks it's a better private purpose. Now, of course, they could use eminent domain if they were going to use it for a public purpose, such as they wanted to build a fire station there, but they already have a fire station just a block away, which of course they're going to abandon in a few short years here when they give it away to the Metropolitan Council or the Ramsey County Rail Authority,
yeah.
somebody that they're going to give it away to. They've already decided they're closing that, so they don't have a public purpose themselves of what they want to build, and they're not going to build public housing that's run by the city of Maplewood, but they want Sherman and Associates to run that public housing. I mean, that's really what's going on here. And so your question about the eminent domain is interesting because if there is a substandard building and that they can demonstrate that there are enough substandard buildings within a particular area, that is one provision where a city can come in and can condemn under their eminent domain power because of that. And this is exactly the same rationale that they are claiming that they're going to buy it at any cost, and then they can use tax increment financing because of the substandard building conditions. that they are way below the building code. So you see, they're relying upon the same rationale that the building needs too much restoration to make it worth it, so therefore it'll make it feasible for a TIF district. Well, why wouldn't that make it also feasible that they could do the eminent domain of it under the same rationale? So they never did discuss any of that in this meeting, and I don't know that they've ever had a policy discussion analyzing the differences between those two tools if you have property that has buildings of substandard conditions that are way below the code conditions. So good question, though.
Okay.
But let's continue and hear what the finance director has to say.
Issue bonds, and we were going to do that over a 3-year period as these properties became available. Shown on the CIP sheet there, we were looking at $2 million for this year. What we had wanted or had hoped to do was sell TIF bonds, but just there aren't enough components together yet to get a TIF district organized. So we have to somehow finance it in the interim and preserve our ability to pay ourselves back with TIF once we do sell TIF bonds. So we talked about a number of options, and one of the options for this property was doing an interfund loan, using some surplus from the sewer fund or the water fund, and then setting up a loan agreement between that fund and the new fund, the development fund. And then when the TIF bonds were issued.
Let's break that down a little bit. The finance director, she says, well, originally we were going to sell bonds, raise money that way as part of our capital improvement program. Well, on these programs, when this city council first hatched those plans, we reported on that we believed that was something that the city could not do, that they could not say buying real estate for development and speculation purposes is not a reason for selling capital improvement bonds. Now, if they were going to purchase that land for building a public building, like a community center or a fire station or a parking ramp, then that would be a capital improvement that is publicly owned, that I believe that they could indeed go out and sell those capital improvement bonds to buy that property. But they discovered you can't just go and do it because you want to go buy land, hold that land, and then speculate that one day a developer is going to come along someday and say, oh, I'd love to take that off your hands. So that was not a well thought out plan. Then the other thing she says is that, well, they don't have enough property there assembled to be able to say that they've got a TIF district, so they can't do the TIF bonds yet, but they need to save and preserve their right. And so the third option they have is, let's go and take a look at how much money we have in our utility funds, and we'll just go and we'll do an interdepartment loan from one of those funds, and we'll take the money, rob the money from the utility fund, and we'll use that to do purchasing the land, to do that land speculation deal.
Question. We have an economic development authority, correct?
Yes.
They have taxing authority, correct?
Yes.
And the members of the Maplewood Economic Development Authority are the same members that are in the Maplewood City Council, correct?
Yes.
They just have a different chairperson. Now, they've been assessing money for about the last 10 years. Why aren't they dipping into those funds to buy this property?
That's a great question. And another corollary to that question is that our Housing and Economic Development Commission, who is supposed to give recommendations to the EDA, were they ever presented with the idea of purchasing the Moose property, and if so, what to do with it?
My guess is no, because about 2017, roughly, they started meeting quarterly. So when this meeting would have happened, the Economic Development or the Housing and Economic Development Commission would have probably met the prior week or maybe a couple weeks after this meeting. But, as you know, this council likes to keep things close to their chest. So the last thing you want this outside committee or this commission to do is to be looking at something like that. They've lost members simply because they were not used for projects like that.
Right, exactly. And I think to answer your original question about whether or not they consider dipping into the funds that they've been taxing for economic development, in this meeting, they do not talk of those funds at all. And I don't believe that there's enough money in those funds for them to even consider using those funds. They maybe could use them in part, but it's not enough.
Yeah, I'm thinking, instead of selling bonds, and then the bonds have to be paid back out of general revenue funds, which are city operations, police, fire, streets, parks, and so forth, you actually use the taxing authority and the borrowing authority of the economic development authority,
Right.
which is a separate set of books, a separate commission, or a separate entity that could borrow this money.
Right, and then it keeps it segregated from the rest of the city's operational
Exactly,
budget.
exactly.
And in the end, what they do is that they rob $2 million from the utility fund, and these funds are typically used to help pay for the road reconstruction work done in Maplewood. And so if you've driven down some of the major roads in Maplewood lately, you know what I'm talking about when you know that it is the capital of potholes. Now, if you haven't been there lately, I challenge you to go drive down Frost Avenue from White Bear Avenue to the roundabout, and you will have so many potholes, you won't even be able to miss them even if you try.
Bring a helmet, and if you don't have one, I'll borrow you my old fire helmet.
Well, let's continue on.
And the TIF start. That's one option that preserves the ability to sell TIF bonds in the future. It's a little bit too soon to know. So it was decided we needed to get more pieces in place before we could actually issue TIF bonds. Did I get that?
Oh, that's right. I mean, 'cause we went into the meeting thinking we were going to include the tax increment bonds with some other. I think we came to the conclusion it was just premature. Ellie's correct. I mean, you're going to have to pull this money out of someplace. Finding it in one of the other funds, sewer and water or whatever else, is perfectly reasonable. You do an inter-fund loan resolution, which is required by the tax increment statute. But what that does mean is that you're starting down the path of doing a district at some point, because you're going to want to pay that sewer and water fund or wherever you get the money from back. Yeah. And the way that happens is by creating a district. So you're taking the first step towards creating a district that's going to have a project that's going to generate the income that over time will be able to pay that interfund loan off. If it doesn't happen, then your sewer and water fund has just bought this piece of property.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel that simple. It's not.
I have to say that it is, I really appreciate everyone's work on this. I see this as very bold, very creative, and I think that this area needs something like this. This area has been sitting basically fallow for years, and it's just basically deteriorating.
We need to do something bold. We need to do something creative. Mr. Waters, I ask you, how bold, how creative is it to say we will spend whatever endless money of taxpayer dollars that really should be going towards road reconstruction and potholes, that we use all that money to just go buy something?
Well, if you're in government, magnificent. It's wonderful. Huge. I mean, huge. If you're in the private sector, it's like, wait a minute. We've got this thing that if we're going to borrow from this fund that we have to pay back, we need to know when this other district is going to be formed. And as I'm listening to that this bold initiative, I'm not hearing, okay, when are we going to create this TIF district? And when are we looking at getting our money back? I guess I'm thinking like a developer, but I'm also thinking like a banker, because I'm going to loan you this money, but I got to have some idea of when it's going to come back. It can't be something down in the future that's going to pay me back. I need to have some dates in mind.
Right.
If we'll just use today, if it's 2019 is the date we're going to buy this property. When are we going to start this look at starting this TIF district, tax increment financing district? 2022, 2023? I have to be able to justify that to my loan committee, that this money is eventually going to come back.
Right, and some of the viewers out there might say, well, if the city is borrowing the money from themselves, it's going to be interest-free. Well, that's actually not correct.
Well, first of all, they're not borrowing it from themselves. It's your money. All they're doing is taking your money from this fund, which they told you they were going to use for street improvements, and they're now going into the land speculation business.
That's correct.
So, it's your money that they're using.
And what happens when these interdepartment loans occur is that interest is charged from the one fund to the other fund that borrowed the money. So the money does, there is interest that is accruing the whole time. So it isn't like $2 million comes out and there's no other additional money that has to be like interest, like if you went and got it from a bank. They on their books keep track of what that accrued interest is. And so the fund that borrowed the money has to pay interest on that money to the other department. Now, of course, if you play the real game of Monopoly, the board game, and you play it properly, did you know that when you borrow money, or that you turn in your houses and you want to get some cash back and you want to buy your house back, you actually have to pay interest on that in the real game of Monopoly.
Correct.
Well, it's the same way here.
Right.
It's all funny money, and yet you still need to pay interest.
Right, exactly. So there's no free lunch, no free loan or anything like that.
That's right. So, and the other thing that would have made this creative, you brought up the fund of the EDA that they've been taxing, having this extra tax that they've been collecting for economic development. Well, maybe the creative solution would be to let that private entity or person who was bidding on this property be successful in their bid, and let them go into that property and then give them a business loan to help with the renovation of that building. Now, that might have been a creative solution, rather than the city just saying, oh, we want to just buy it at any cost, we're going to demolish it, and then we're going to put up high-density housing. Where's the creativity?
There is no creativity in that whatsoever. It's just standard business plan, page 32, chapter 3, page 32,
That's right, it's the same MO. Well, let's continue.
Certainly see this as an opportunity, and if who are the futurists in here, Mayor? Any other futurists?
Mr. Funk.
Look at this,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm not a futurist either, but
I think this is a good idea.
I look at that this is both.
Now, real quick, I got to tell you the insider joke of all this. When Marley Abrams is saying, oh, who's the futurist here? Oh, Mayor, you're the futurist. So the only reason that they're talking like that is because a couple years back at one of their retreats, when they all had to do this personal inventory of their strengths and weaknesses, that somehow or other, Mayor Nora Slawick came up with a couple of extra points in being a futurist. And yet, we have never seen any evidence of that in her 5 years of being the mayor of Maplewood. She has not been a futurist. She's been a rubber stamp, but she's not been a futurist for Maplewood. So that's what the insider joke is with that comment. So let's continue.
This is very futuristic, and I think that our city has to do something like this. we have all of these things coming together with transit coming in here, and this is going to change the dynamics of our city. You know, I look at what else is happening in our city. I look at, you know, not that far away, we've got the mall, and we've got that kind of sinking, and how do we shore that up? But we've got to, I think we have to be bold on this, and I am not a gambler. You know, I'm rather, you probably know I'm rather fiscally conservative, but I think that our city needs something like this if we are going to get where we want to be. We aren't going to do this little bits at a.
But the question is, where do they want to be? They have never established what this goal is, this lofty goal of where they want to be. All they know is that they need to say yes to the purple line and that they need to say yes to the gold line, even though neither of those lines truly serve Maplewood. That Maplewood is just a pass-through stop. The gold line, for instance, Maplewood residents don't even have a place to park so that they can get on the gold line once it's established and the station is at 3M. Residents can't even get on at the gold line. At the Gladstone area where the purple line is supposedly going to stop, as we've reported here, it is suggested that really those folks who are going to ride the purple line from the Gladstone neighborhood, that if they have to drive to the Gladstone neighborhood, they're simply going to be parking their cars on the streets, that there is not going to be any park and ride of any kind whatsoever there because there's no place to put one. So where's the future? Go ahead.
And this might help to force a couple other issues.
Right.
Besides, I don't think it's going to take too long if we start doing some other decent housing and this is moving east, that blankety blank trailer park will go away.
I agree with Mary Lee. I think also this property is a linchpin to the neighborhood. If we don't get this one, we might as well forget it. I mean, it's one of the corners.
It's a major corner.
This needs to be a part of the story. I'm really concerned about that parcel 20, the stucco business.
Well, but maybe if you see something happen,
Well,
it'll roll.
honestly, what my concern is once everybody around there really understands what's happening, that it's going to start a price escalation. And so I'm wondering if we have any code options there to just start. Also, I think we need to not all of a sudden show up and start enforcing all kinds of stuff, but if we start just incrementally trying to do some enforcement there,
Send Chris over.
that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, I mean, we just have to do it, and we have to.
I'm watching this, and it's like I'm listening to Kathy Julian. She just likes to use big government to throw them out of the property. I agree. This is an important corner, so I think you ought to move slowly. I think you ought to be looking more for tax-paying property rather than as a transit stop. Because, like you said, where's the park and ride going to go? The only place you can put a park and ride is you have to buy the Monk Funeral Home and the trailer court behind it, and then there's one building that used to be Gladstone Lumber. That's the only place you can put a park and ride, and you're going to have to put a multi-level park and ride in there because you're not going to get all the cars on flat land. So I agree that this is an important corner, but it just seems like, as I'm listening to this, I'm kind of talking all over, Kathy Julian just loves to use the heavy hand of government to get what she wants, and she could care less who gets hurt.
Right, and even Brian Smith goes along on those coattails in that he's saying, well, maybe we can use code enforcement. If we can't buy that parcel that's next to it, well, then we're just going to have to start going out there with our code enforcer and put some pressure on them. Well, gee whiz, like you said, the heavy hammer of government.
If I'm a developer and I see you're using the heavy hand to get people out of there, why would I want to come to your city and develop a project? What if all of a sudden you decide to turn on me for some reason because you don't like me? You're going to use the heavy hand of government to get me out of the way for someone else that you do what?
Well, but remember, they got the preferred developer, Sherman and Associates.
Well, it's preferred today. Who's it tomorrow?
Let's continue.
I think it's sort of all or nothing here.
You know, the alternative, this idea, even if it was a possible entertainment type facility, we know how great the myth is going with that. We don't know. I think I want to be more affirmative and more intentional and direct that this would be housing and this would be some retail kinds of things and some really up the game.
And
in our
if we
city.
do that down the road to the east, where the Maplewood Bakery and everything is, that's getting pretty seedy.
Mhm.
That could be another place where somebody could go more for that type of thing,
Right.
because there's plenty of property to
Redevelopment.
Yes.
People might be willing to redo their building, you know, I
I mean,
mean,
you know, yeah, I think it's so close to actually the Sherman property and then this property, the original
Yeah.
Sherman property, and then this one. I just don't see that we should skip it.
no.
I think we can push the
Yeah.
alternatives on that next block, and it might come more and fire station.
Councilmember Marley Abrams, she says, now keep in mind, she is a litigator. She's been a practicing attorney for 30 years. She knows how to use words that have meaning. And yet when she says she wants the council to be more affirmative, intentional, and direct, how and what does that mean in the context of deciding if they're going to throw a bunch of money at this purchase to buy this property? I just don't know what that means to be affirmative, intentional, and direct, other than to say, well, we've got our big checkbook out and we're just going to write out, sky's the limit. I guess you can't be much more direct than
Yeah,
that.
it's just going to be a blank check. Here's the date, here's the signature, take what you need.
Right.
Just send us a receipt when you're done.
And keep in mind, you heard them make mention about an entertainment or event center. And with that entertainment and event center, that is what is being proposed by this other entity or individual who's interested in buying the Moose Lodge property. The Moose Lodge property is exactly suited for that purpose because that's currently a lot of what happens at the Moose Lodge right now, in that they have events, they have banquets, they have meetings. That's what they do there. And so you see this other entity who's interested in the property, they're interested in it because it's already zoned and the land is guided for that particular use. But this council, they don't like that particular use, even though the zoning permits it and the land use allows it. So this is how I guess they're being intentional, affirmative, and direct, is that they are just going to go and buy the land and put it to a different purpose rather than having changed the land use zoning of it when they could have during their comprehensive plan. Well, there you go. I guess that's how you're intentional and direct. Well, let's continue.
If you look at this map, it kind of shows you what it would look like potentially if we could buy out those ones, do that, do this piece down here. And then maybe that's enough for a top district, but I think we want to move forward, so what else, what other
So the
decisions?
next question would be how much you want to offer. What would you like to counter?
Well, what do you think makes sense?
So we're at a $45,000 difference right now?
Yeah, it's like, you made an offer on a piece of property for $880. The sellers come back and another $45,000. So I would.
I would recommend we just do the 9 1/4 and not lose this other 25 grand or something.
Is that what they proposed to us as 9 1/4?
Yeah.
And is there anything weird about that 9 1/4? I mean, you've seen the paperwork that.
Now, Joe, did you catch that important legal lingo there? Is there anything weird about that counteroffer, where the seller is saying, well, they'll counteroffer and that they'll sell it to us for $935,000. Is there anything weird about
that?
that? That's the new legal lingo.
Weird.
From a skilled litigator and an attorney of 30 years. Let's continue.
So I just saw it. All they did was take my document.
There's nothing weird in there.
And some crossing wire.
So it's really weird.
Cross out 880 and put 925 in.
My kind of red one.
You know?
Yeah.
So they're going, but then what about this other party?
Well, I haven't read anything else.
But there's nothing in there that references the other party in that agreement.
And we don't know about the other party.
Well, no, there's not gonna be anything in here. I mean, this is the agreement that they're trying to work with us. So you can accept this and know that you have a deal, or you can do what people normally do. They counter and they kind of go back and forth.
918.
I think we want to accept it as we're
Yeah.
hearing from you guys, right? It's
I
just,
mean, we
let's not lose
could try
this.
900 and see if we can save a few bucks, but to me, it just feels like,
But if there's some other party in on this,
yeah,
I
I
think
just.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah,
wondering.
just
Which
go
I-
with
Is that why no one knows?
We don't know
I mean,
for sure.
I'm not trying to talk you into or out of anything.
Right.
I wouldn't get too
Oh, Tony.
buffaloed by that, because we don't know that there is another
Right.
party. It could be
Yeah.
his brother-in-law saying, you know, we don't know what the dollar amount is.
Or it could be someone saying, the sky's the limit with the city. Just get whatever you can.
And keep in mind, the Moose Lodge doesn't have a brother-in-law.
True.
So you see, that of course is, I know he's just being flip about it all.
Right.
But in reality, it is our belief that it is an entity that later on chose a different location off of White Bear Avenue to see if they could put their entertainment and banquet center in the Junior Achievement Building off of White Bear Avenue. And that particular entity is a Hmong-owned entity. Now, wouldn't it have made sense for this Hmong-owned entity to have a banquet and entertainment hall just only a half a block from the Hmong Legacy Village funeral home, which is on the other quadrant of that intersection of Frost and English?
Well, it does fit together nicely because you have the funeral home on the south side of Frost, and then, you know, after the burial, I don't know how a Hmong funeral goes, I'll just do a traditional funeral. You know, after you have the funeral, everyone goes to the cemetery, and they come back. In this particular case, they can come back and park on the Hmong funeral parking lot, and then you just walk right across the street over to the entertainment facility. It all makes sense.
And so you can see why it would be certainly an ideal property if that were the scenario and the business plan that that particular entity had in mind. And of course, that's exactly what the city wants to break down, that they want to have their housing there. They don't want to have other people's plans in their way. So let's continue with our audio.
Extensive money to remodel and to get that in there and try to reoccupy that is a significant investment, probably $100,000.
Something more than that.
Yeah.
I mean, that is
I think one thing we do know is that there is a lot of interest in this property.
Mhm.
And for those that said, I think they're definitely, so.
Now that's Councilmember Tu Zhang, and we hear very little from him during this whole entire closed council meeting. And of course, we heard very little from him the whole time at any council meetings. But here he's saying, we do know. He's very affirmative about that and direct and intentional. That
He's intentionally quiet.
We do know that there is a lot of interest, and yet just a little bit a while ago, we've got the attorney saying, well, we really don't know what the level of interest is. It could be the seller's brother-in-law. So which is it? Do we really know or don't we know? Let's continue.
This is basically 13% over tax value, which to me seems like a pretty good deal if we came in at 9.25. I mean, that's a 13%.
I can, the 9.25.
Our target is 20 to 25%. I mean,
Right.
that's what the other.
That'll happen next, after we
What?
start going here, that'll be the next.
And then I would like to discuss real briefly the other two adjoining pieces. Then, does it make sense?
Now, before we go on and listen to their discussion of the other adjoining pieces owned by totally different companies and people, you heard how this price that Maplewood is deciding that is okay to pay is 13% above what the market value is. So that means that they are putting everybody else out of the market, because everybody else has to generally go and get a loan, and a bank is never going to lend you money to buy property at a price 13% more than the market value, because if they got to foreclose, they don't want to be 13% short in the end. And so that is what they are currently looking at. And then you heard the city manager, Melinda Coleman, say, well, what's next is our goals of what we really think we're going to start paying above market value, and that's 20 to 25% above market value to buy land, to have our way, to do the land use and construct what we want in the city of Maplewood, regardless of what the populace or the residents of Maplewood want, believe, or need. Because after all, local municipal government officials, the administrators, the top administrators in Maplewood, and this council, they know best. They know best. So let's hear what the discussion is about the other adjoining parcels that they have their eye on.
To try to actively pursue those two other properties. So it's on the back of this map.
Yeah.
Don't be
Flip that over. Those other two pieces are there, and you can see the price point here as well.
But that one is really zombie.
The 1315.
I think so. I don't know at what point code enforcement becomes extortion.
Well,
No, I'm serious. I mean,
We need to be a little careful with that.
that's what I'm concerned about. That's what I'm saying. I think starting
Across the
small and making
Across the trail.
Yeah.
But
I guess my thought is there, obviously we're going to have to pay more than that value there. Is there a number? Can we, if we were to go maybe, say 20% above each of those values, would that be acceptable to council?
And then get all of them?
And then get that whole piece?
If we could, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really monopoly.
yeah.
It feels like monopoly.
Well,
I want Clark Place.
redevelopment business and,
Let me just say one other thing. Again, this is all assuming that we're going to be able to create a redevelopment tax increment district. One of the keys of which is that more than 50% of the principal structures can be, will be deemed through an investigation to be substandard.
Well, 1315 is certainly added to it.
Well, the reason I'm raising that is, as I said, if we buy the lodge, we've got a provision in there, a contingency in there, that it has to qualify. What that's going to mean is that before we closed on the property, we get LHB to do a review and find out whether this property qualifies as a redevelopment district. If the district is only the Moose property, then there's only one principal building. That's the only structure that needs to be found to be substandard, because you got more than 50%. As you start adding additional buildings, you have to keep the math in mind. As I said, I drove by very quickly. 1321 didn't look like it was in bad shape to me. I don't know what other
The
people.
1315 is.
I know.
So that inspired 1321 to do anything.
I don't
Let me ask a
know.
question.
My point is, even if you get 1315, then, well, it's also substandard, so all right.
So my question is though, so say we bought all
So this is the discussion that's going on that is very enlightening, that you would never hear in an open meeting. Because as you mentioned, Mr. Waters, they're being very frank about how they feel about this whole process. It's like Monopoly. Yes, it's like Monopoly. I want Park Place. They're playing with other people's money. And then they're talking about the various parcels. Now, while that doesn't really have any bearing upon this purchase agreement and the proposed negotiations of that purchase agreement, which is the reason they closed this meeting, they're now talking about other issues that are unrelated
To the original.
to the original
reason why the meeting was closed in the first place.
That's exactly right. And so while this is interesting that they are talking about what their next steps are, it doesn't really have a bearing on whether they're going to decide to accept this counter offer or to offer a different counter offer in response, because they've already essentially decided that. You heard the conversation where Mayor Nora Slawick says, well, I think we should just accept. And then Brian Smith says, well, maybe we could go down a little bit, but why not just get it over with? So you see, they really have decided that they are going to come up with a number. So that discussion is over with. Now, this is all extra discussion, which is actually not on the topic for which they closed the meeting. And that is not necessarily allowed, because you're not supposed to talk about other business other than the purpose for closing the meeting. But let's continue on as they talk about these parcels.
Three parcels here.
Yep.
Would we be looking at that 50% number as the group of the three
Yes.
or each individually?
No, it's whatever you put in the tax increment district.
So the footage of that moose lot should help the overall, because it's a big building?
No, it counts as one building.
1321 is not good. I've talked to the landlord.
It looks
The landlord
horrible.
called me about Diana Longer's office because
Okay, let's set this up. First of all, now, because this is actually some of the most humorous stuff in the whole meeting, because 1321 is actually at that particular intersection of Frost and English, and that is a building that there are several tenants. There's a laundromat, a furniture store, a tattoo parlor, and then for over 10 years, my law office. Now, of course, at that law office, it's a typical law office. You've got a lot of law books, and that's where I met my clients and did my work every day. That was the law office. Well, now, we heard the city attorney earlier in this audio say that he drove by 1321. It looks like a really nice building. Other council members indicated it doesn't look like there's any problem with 1321, and that of course will create a problem for their creating a TIF district, because it is in such a good condition. So now here's Mayor Nora Slawick. Keep in mind, this is March 2018, and now she's saying that 1321 is a mess. It is a major disaster. That she talked to the landlord, and this is where we're coming into this, is that my office apparently was a disaster. So let's hear what kind of a disaster she believes there was.
hoarding and there was animals in her office, which is the end one in here. So that particular office, which now her shingle is gone, there's something wrong with it.
Did you hear the wisecrack from Kathleen
Yes,
Duneman?
yes, absolutely. And so here's the thing, is that in October of 2017, I had the opportunity to move my office closer to my home. Who doesn't want to have this livable, sustainable lifestyle where your place of work is close to home?
I'd love it.
That's right. So now I can actually walk to work. Isn't that amazing? So in October 2017, I had this opportunity to move my office, which I did after over 10 years. But you heard Nora Slawick say that while she talked to the landlord about this horrible Diana Longery being a hoarder and having animals and all in her office. And by the way, I do take offense that she's talking about my clients as animals.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry, but my clients are not animals. And yes, as a law office, I had many a law book, a lot of Northwest Seconds and other law books. You know what? If she calls hoarding law books in a law office hoarding, then you know what? I'm proud to have the law library. No problem there, Nora Slawick. But the thing is that she said that she went to stop by and she found I wasn't there. That's right. You know what? The office was vacant. It was empty in March of 2018. I hadn't been there since October of 2017, and that office actually was only just now occupied by a new tenant only a month ago, and this would have been March of 2019.
So you're looking at 6 months from the time you moved.
Right, so that office has been vacant for 18 months. And with it being vacant for 18 months, that shows you the amount of commerce going on in that neighborhood. So here you go.
I mean, it's bad.
Yeah, so I guess what we're asking, one, if you want us to counter to 900, we can do that, knowing that if they say 925, is council committed to that number?
Yes.
Okay, and the second one, do you have a tolerance to go above and beyond the asking price up to 20% as a starter?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, we won't go any further. Just,
That's- yeah.
you know, we'll have another discussion on those other parcels, and we'll talk again about the tax increment stuff, because, again, I want everybody to understand what you can and can't do. And if we buy it, if we're successful in buying this property, Ellie's gonna pull that money out of some fund, and then, as I said, we're starting down the road of having to figure out how we're gonna reimburse that money.
Right.
We're making round numbers.
Well, I think that what I hear you saying is that we're making this contingent on this being a TIF district.
Yes.
TIF eligible.
Yes,
TIF eligible.
but what that means is that you've got to figure out on this property, what can you qualify as a district? And you may or may not be able to include all of it. I mean, if there are 3 principal structures on this block, 2 of them have to be substandard to be included to make it a district. So you got to figure that out. You've got to get a developer. You've got to have some, even if you give the property away, you got to have somebody who's willing to come in and build something that's going to create value, because that's the only way you're going to get any increment. Something's got to happen within 5 years. There's a 5-year knockdown rule. I mean, we're setting in place things that have to happen. And it's not until there's a project and somebody's built something and somebody's paying taxes that there's increment to reimburse this. I'm not trying to discourage anybody. I just want everybody to understand what we're talking about.
But we wouldn't create the TIF district until we had a project.
Well,
Is that
that's
correct?
true, but you've spent the money.
But we've
Yes,
spent the money
I
is
get
the-
that, I
the
get that.
issue.
That's a real.
So the city manager jumps in and says, well, we wouldn't start the TIF district right away so the clock won't start ticking. But the city attorney cautions them, but you've spent the money.
Right.
But you've spent the money.
Exactly.
So this is how they play Monopoly with taxpayer dollars in the city of Maplewood. I want to thank you, Mr. Waters, for coming out here on the show.
I need a good laugh tonight. Thank you.
We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.